So we're here today in Crawford County in a small town called New Richmond. Now, what most people don't know is Crawford County was a hotbed of Underground Railroad activity. It's sort of at the crossroads of 2 or 3 different routes to help escaped slaves get to their freedom in Canada or even here in Crawford County, where there was a large population of free African Americans. And the place that we're at right now is the remains of John Brown's tannery. Now, John Brown was an abolitionist. We're going to talk a little bit about him. He was an abolitionist, a person who was against slavery, and he helped escaped slaves get to their freedom. He spent 10 years of his life here in near Meadville, just northeast of Meadville. But it was his raid on Harper's Ferry that was probably the catalyst for the Civil War. It's probably what got the Civil War going. Beyond that, we also want to talk a little bit more about the Underground Railroad movement and another character that comes to mind.
Yeah, there's a gentleman by the name of Richard Henderson who had a barbershop down in Meadville. And we'll talk more about when we get to his site, but he was also part of the Underground Railroad along with a family called Rudolph down in Meadville. They were the stopping point before the slaves would come here to New Richmond, and then they would pass on up either toward Erie or Westfield, New York.
So John Brown was born in 1800 in Connecticut. About the age of 5, his family moved to Hudson, Ohio, which was a place that was a sort of capital for anti-slavery, and his father Owen got into the anti-slavery movement there. His father was a tanner, which meant that he treated leather hides and they made leather goods, and Brown started to learn that business there. Now at the age of 16, Brown is going to leave his family and head back to New England, first to Connecticut, and then he's going to move on from there to go to school in order to be a minister. Brown and his family were all very, very religious. The problem for Brown is that they ran out of money whenever he was there in school to become a minister, and he was forced to go back home about a year after starting to attend school. Now, as he gets back home, back in Hudson, Ohio, he opens a tannery with his brother, and he's going to work at that tannery for a short period of time until around 1821. In 1821, he's going to get married, and he's going to look to sort of open a new business somewhere else. And that's when he's going to come here to Crawford County. He buys this large tract of land here and across the street, which was set aside originally for Revolutionary War soldiers. They had never claimed this land. This is sort of like their payment for serving in the war. They had never claimed this land. So the American government decided, well, we'll sell this land very cheap. And he got a great deal on all of this territory. He purchased this land, immediately set up the tannery, the tannery behind me, which is the remains of the tannery behind me, and a house and a barn on this property.
Here on the foundation of the John Brown Tannery, across the road was the place where his homestead would have been. While he was living here and running the tannery, he did start a school, a church, and also ran the local post office. And a lot of historians really theorize that it's his connections through the post office that helped him out with the Underground Railroad. Now, while he was here, unfortunately, his wife, Dianthe, had passed away, as well as some of his young children. They are actually buried up back on the back part of the homestead, and we'll go take a look at those grave sites a little later on. But in 1835, with the business running here, that John Brown decided to relocate and moved back to Ohio with a new bride, and it was his nursemaid, Miss Day, who was actually from Crawford County.
So it's hard to believe, but the foundations of this tannery were built almost 200 years ago in 1826, right? Now, during John Brown's time here, he spent about 10 years living in this area. It's estimated that he helped over 2,500 slaves escape to their freedom. Now, we don't know this information, and we don't know exactly where the Underground Railroad went because it was secret, right? They couldn't let it out to everybody that where they were running or who was going where or what was happening. But historians estimate about 2,500 people were able to come through this and escape to freedom. In 1835, Brown is going to leave this area and head back to Ohio, and that's where Mr. Weibel will pick up with his story.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about this figure is that all this information that we're talking about here today is only really known because of things that happened 20 years after he leaves Pennsylvania. John Brown isn't a famous anything until 20 years later when we get closer to the Civil War. And so what we know about John Brown and his connection to the Civil War starts in 1856 in Kansas. A lot of people don't realize this, but in 1856 we actually had a miniature Civil War, as I like to say, out in Kansas, out in the West. And it was the settlers out there that were fighting and killing each other over the issue of whether or not Kansas would eventually become a slave state or a free state. John Brown, I guess unfortunately, becomes famous, or maybe infamous, in Kansas for what becomes known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. And it is an attack on a small settlement of pro-slavery settlers where John Brown brutally murders, dismembers, and it's a really brutal attack on these these pro-slavery settlers. And he does it all in the name of his feelings about anti-slavery and abolition. Now, those months out in Kansas in 1856 are sort of the precursor to a few years later in 1859, just before the beginning of the Civil War, when John Brown shows up again in a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Today it's in West Virginia. At the time it was Virginia, where he ends up leading a raid on a United States federal arsenal that was in that town in an attempt to steal weapons from the United States government, take those weapons and move through Virginia and start arming slaves on plantations with these weapons, with his intentions of creating a slave revolution that would spread through the South in an attempt to end slavery once and for all. Of course that fails, he's captured, and that's the end of John Brown's life. He is found guilty of treason against the United States, and he is hanged shortly after that event in Harper's Ferry. It's the end of his life, but it's in many ways the beginning of his legacy, because from there we see the beginnings of the Civil War, and of course from there we come to places like this to learn more about this man.
And he becomes sort of a heroic figure in the North after that. I read somewhere that from the time of his death in 1859 up until Abraham Lincoln is assassinated in 1865, that John Brown is the most famous man in America at that time, because he was seen as this heroic guy who got the Civil War moving and heading in that direction.
Okay, so we were just at John Brown's Tannery, which is one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. But before people got to his tannery, we made a stop here in Meadville with Richard Henderson at his barber shop, which would have been back here about where that yellow house is. That yellow house is not the barber shop, but that's where the barber shop would have been. And that would have been one of the stops on the way to John Brown's Tannery.
So here in Meadville at the Henderson Barbershop. The Henderson Barbershop was actually started by two brothers. It was Robert and Richard Henderson, and they were actually freed slaves that came to Meadville from Maryland. So they were very anxious to also kind of help out with some of the Underground Railroad that was going on up in this area. Robert left the area of Meadville and started his own barbershop over in Brookville, whereas Richard maintained the barbershop here at Arch Street. There was an instance in 1854 that was noted in Meadville where some slaves came up and they were just ahead of their owners, and Henderson actually took the slaves into his barbershop, hid them out, and then they were transported out to a nearby farm where they were actually hid into the basement of the farm. Also, in 1932, Richard's son Edward, who by this time was very old and in a home up in Allegheny, he was interviewed about his father's involvement, and he stated there were several times where he would be heading to bed at night and there would be these strangers who were being accepted into their home, and in the morning when he got up, they were gone. So he was proof that the Hendersons were involved in the Underground Railroad.